universe. Welcome back to...
He's the entrepreneur behind the fashion brand Diesel.
When you use something special, you can create an attention. And with this attitude, I have developed everything.
And he's now in charge of a fashion empire.
They're looking for a brand. You can create an attention. And
有小伙伴在线吗？
在原油的价格确实出现了一个回落，因为市场一方面是在衡量一下地缘政治的一个供应可能中断的一个担忧，另一方面呢，也是在权衡像飓风与尔顿对佛罗里达州整个燃料需求的一个不利的影响。同样呢，我们也看到利比亚石油的供应恢复到央行危机前的一个水平，原油整体供给的一个增加呢，也是对整个价格形成一个打压。那么有色金属方面呢，价格多数是呈现一个上涨，尤其呢像伦敦的一个铝价涨价是比较坚强的，因为市场主要是担心呢几样对于重要的一个出口国供应可能中断，对全球供给的一个不利性的一个影响。我们在外盘的影响之下，国内整个的一个基础价格还是坚强的，国内的一个换汇价格呢，
拍个照片留念。
原油表现的一个更强。农产品方面呢，是呈现相对偏弱的一个走势。
很久没有搞这个在线直播了。
谢谢侯雪玲的介绍。接下来呢，我们看一下美股期货的开盘情况。我们看到 IF 主力合约呢是目前上涨1.26%，IH 的主力合约上涨1.33%，IC 主力合约呢目前是上涨0.56%。好，我们再来关注一下人民币汇率的一个情况。好，我们看到目前呢，美元离岸人民币呢是上涨0.26%，来到了7.0865。好，那现在时间呢已经是到了9点30分，我们一起来关注一下今天
国内开盘喽
情况。我们一起来用9方智投软件来关注一下。我们看到今天开盘呢，这个上证指数是上涨0.50%，深圳成指呢是高开0.06%，科创50指数呢是低开0.05%，创业板指呢是低开0.09%，沪深300指数高开0.38%，上证50指数呢是高开0.46%。好，我们再来关注一下行业板块的这个涨跌幅的变化的情况。我们看到目前领涨居前的板块这个大金融板块呢依然涨幅比较强劲，这个银行板块、多元金融等等都是超过3%的这样的一个涨幅。另外呢，我们看到房地产服务、房地产开发也是涨幅居前，还有这个林业板块、环境治理、这个农业综合板块包括冶钢原料等等都是位于涨幅榜的前列。另外，我们再来看看开盘之后这个跌幅居前的板块有哪些。我们看到这个证券板块呢是出现了下挫1.48%的这样的一个跌幅。另外呢，我们看到像白酒、饮料乳品、这个半导体板块、教育板块、焦炭等等都是出现了下跌。乘用车还有这个。
So we got inflation numbers out over the weekend as well, with the CPI consumer inflation coming off a bit. Actually, that was the slowest in around 3 months. So the inflation cooled, and then the producer prices, the deflation that we've been seeing for about 2 years now, deepening now 2.8%. So both on the headline, missing some of those estimates. A high base feeding into this, of course. Last September we did see things picking up, but falling commodity prices, most notably oil, factoring into this as well. But of course, the the weaker confidence and demand we're seeing across China as well. Hopefully some of this fiscal stimulus and package will help stabilize those prices in the long run. But we also, of course, look ahead to the trade numbers, which we'll be getting in the coming hours for an idea of how those outbound and inbound shipments are holding up. The expectations is that things should be softening in, but we'll have to see once we
大概直播1个小时吧。
because of course we do have the Hong Kong markets playing catch up this morning.
Yeah, that's right, Sam. We were closed on Friday for the grave sweeping, and the Hong Kong market playing catch up today, also reacting to the stimulus announcement or lack thereof that we got at the weekend from the Ministry of Finance. The Hong Kong market opening weaker by 1%, 21,033 last traded. The Hang Seng Tech Index down almost 2.5%. If we pull up the heavyweight stocks, offering a little bit of support, shares in HSBC managing a gain of 0.4%, 68.45. But the pre-market gains that we had in some of the China tech plays, that is not apparent anymore. Alibaba shares pulling back 1.6%. AIA also weaker on the session by 1.5%. Let's just take a quick look at some of the mainland property stocks. I was looking at the Hang Seng Mainland Property Index, and that was a traded firmer on the session. And we do have some gains here, with the exception of Kaisa. Sunac shares better for 3.7%, pushing 4%, 275, long 4, and China Resources Land better for 1.5%. Also worthwhile to check in on the Macau gaming stocks. So there's been some development over in the enclave. The other special administrative region is going to be marking its 25th anniversary of its handover at the end of this year. And as we all know, that also moves in cycle with a new chief executive. And there was an election at the weekend. It was uncontested, so this was widely expected that Sam Ho Fun
CSI 300的沪深300基本上是在 A 股是在平开吧，看一下A50。
And that was when President Xi Jinping was last in Hong Kong for the 25th handover anniversary. And as we're showing you this is because I'm expecting him to come for the 25th anniversary celebrations in Macau as well. So that's Sam Ho Fai. Those are file pictures of him from yesterday at.
我再来听一下彭博说的。
State Financial Supervision and Administration Bureau. Now, this could be many things. This could be
我这边是有3个直播员，一个是彭博，一个是 CNBC 的亚洲台，一个是第一财经，也比较齐全了，应该是。
Kind of a hedonistic lifestyle in the financial sector. They want to damp down reckless speculation in the market. On the other hand, they also want to promote private enterprise law and as well instill confidence in private enterprise.
现在应该就是对这个周6的时候，财政部的这个发布会再做一些解读。
Yeah, let me come out with a pun there. Is this rally justified? Ministry of Justice coming out. Monday.
Is that a rhetorical question?
Well, let's put that question to our next guest, shall we?
在美国这边，投资者一般就是看 FXI， 这个应该是追踪港股比较多一点的富时中国指数。这个在 Robinhood 上面是有夜盘的，然后我们可以看一下，夜盘基本上是平开，然后 KYP 是跌了1.7，MCHI 是应该是对标 A 股的大盘的，这跟 XI 不一样，这个也是在下跌了1.几。
额外资产做一定的风险对冲来降低我们组合的一个波动。那在7成的权益里面，我们可以关注一些前2-3年超跌，然后因为现在也慢慢进入到了一个季报期，然后关注它的基本面的一些标的。那目前来说，我看行业上像医药，或者说像一些偏科技类、一些成长类的，他们的估值其实存在一定的被低估的一些情况。对个人投资者来说，做资产配置的时候可以考虑关注一些这些有基本面支撑，同时弹性比较大的一些。
我们现在把这个声音切换到了第一财经的中文的这个评述。
来关注一下今天港股的开盘的情况。我们看到恒生指数呢是低开0.36%，国企指数呢是低开0.09%。 红筹指数呢是高开1.14%，恒生科技指数呢是低开1.43%。那么关于港股的更多情况呢，我马上要连线到的是第一财经驻香港记者赵兰，请他来为我们具体介绍一下。你好，赵兰。
你好，刘静。港股上周全周回吐近1500点，科指领跌，累计下挫9%。今早开盘，大盘低开20点，仍在21200点上方，科指低开0.7%，国指低开0.2%左右。市场观望情绪较重，不过板块方面，内房股仍为活跃，优质民企内房龙湖领涨蓝筹，高开超4%；国企内房中海外同样高开4%，润地高开2%，同系物管股华润万象生活高开1.6%。消息面，房企公布上月经营数据，同比降幅普遍低于市场预期。不过
看到现在频道里边有5个观众，我其实是很久没有播过了，只是最近 A 股免 A 有这个行情嘛，然后就来参与一下。
香港市场消息称
We can't solve this problem.
CNBC 现在就说中国的 stimulus details not clear。看一下我自己国内的券商账户。
Buy and sell with record volume, which is great for our business. But David, I don't know how long you have been following China. So if you look at the credential of whether it's PBOC governors or CSRC chairman.
目前来看，国内的券商呢，就是大 A 的，沪深300、中证50这些，其实还是上涨的。
Educated economists, policymaker, and currency managers, right? So they are highly capable. The way I read it, there are 4 key focus, right? So they've been focusing on local debt issuance, which is critical to solve the real estate and also stimulate the economy. They have addressed not many people taking attention yet. The bank's core capitals, so this could potentially can really have that multiplier impact on the economy, and also bring potential banks to reevaluate, which is a large component of the index. And the third is on the property side, and the last is on the consumptions. I think the direction of traffic is clear. Again, to have a physical number beyond what they budgeted, it needs NPC.
That can go in that direction. We're showing a chart, Wendy, now on earnings revisions and how analysts are actually seeing profits are actually rising.
Thomas, I don't know if you remember, but many years ago, former head of the PBOC, Zhou Xiaochuan, said at a conference, there will come this Minsky moment when lenders will say, we no longer want to lend simply because the property market is too toppy. And he warned about this many, many years ago. And of course, this has come to fruition now. And so consequently, when you have a look at what is happening in China, the property market is too toppy. Prices have become exorbitant. And so consequently, it was only natural that property prices corrected. And so what we're actually seeing now is the correct price for the property market. But to try and stimulate the property market and stimulate prices back up again is probably the wrong thing to do. Maybe what they need to do is to just leave things alone at the moment. And as I said, the 3 don'ts, they don't. China shouldn't really
这些国外频道都是绿色上涨，国内的 APP 是红色上涨，经常会搞混了。
So let's just leave it alone, and then we'll actually sort of be able to find a level, rather than to try and stimulate what is going on. Because the housing market problem is huge. Until you solve the housing market problem, you're not going to solve consumer confidence in China. But maybe it is insoluble at the moment simply because it is too expensive. Or it was too expensive, but now it's actually okay.
But David, if you look at the property market price in general in China, it corrected about a third in terms of price point on average basis. In any major market like US, right, during the subprime crisis, when you have a 1/3 of
听一下彭博在说什么。
Compared to 2004, 2014, and you're saying once basically the hopes of all this fiscal
刚才 CNBC 基本上都在说
the dust that
房
over this
产
magic
方面的。
number, there's going to be more hope around stabilization funds and the like. How do you compare it to what we've seen in the past?
So China has had 3 rounds of market reform guidelines. So 1.0, that was 2004, right? And then 2.0 was 14. And then 10 years later, we're now at 24. So the upside in CSI 300 in 1.0 was 359%. Then it went down to 151%. So we're probably at 20-25% upside. And you would hope there's institutional building based on best practices around the region, you know, the type of national stabilization fund. We saw that in other markets, I think Japan, and then an SIP, systematic investment plan in India. So we're hopeful because the national team, you know, the operation of it, we can find some traces from the ETF flows, and recently
有点意思，好像是港股在跌，然后大 A 在涨。
swap facility will give us some sense, but it would just be more transparent and process driven if we see the stabilization fund and funds like or institutions like SIP. Yeah.
How does this affect broader Asia strategy? You look at the region as well. I mean, has this resurgence in China in some way affected how, where you think the big winners will be next year? Big winners so far: India, Taiwan, Korea.
I looked at Asia strategy with 2 other colleagues, Rajiv Batra and then Mixo. I think at this point, the incomings are very much about where do I move some of the flows from elsewhere in the region into China. If we look at last week's flow, EM has a huge inflow, right? Highest since October.
这个如果可以的话，其实可以推到其他像 Twitch 或者其他的直播源上，可能这样的话比较有意思。是很久没有搞直播这种东西了。
had a modest inflow. It was primarily China. So I think people recognize this is an inexpensive asset and has potential for earnings upside. Yeah.
Wendy, great to have you. Wendy Liu there, Chief Asia and China Equity Strategist at JP Morgan. To digest all the news that we got over the weekend, it seems like mainland equities as well continue to gather strength here on the back of what we've been hearing over the weekend. So it may not be just that disappointment that we saw earlier when it comes to commodities. You are actually seeing equities catching a bid here today. You can also turn to your Bloomberg for more on this. T-Live Go to get plenty of commentary analysis from our expert editors. That is all happening this morning. Plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
哇，好像有我群里的小伙伴居然看到了。
Today's most active stocks up.
这个 CNBC 啊，这个第一财经直播非常有意思，他自己也是播自己的那个网页，然后他每次都自己要刷新一会儿，他刷新的时候这个就没了。沪深300已经上涨到1.6了，然后恒生已经也转为上涨了0.1几，应该是现在对市场对周六的那个发布会还是有分歧。
That one seems to be still the laggard here this morning, that catch down as Dave mentioned. But we're going to focus all of them on geopolitics now, where China's military is holding drills around Taiwan that it says are warning to the self-rule island's government to halt what it calls separatist acts. Now, a spokesman says the exercises involve Army, Navy, Air, and rocket forces. Taiwan's defense ministry says that it dispatched forces to respond. Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te said last week that he would stand up to the challenges posed by China.
Now, Washington's support for Taiwan amid China's growing assertiveness is one of the diplomatic flashpoints that the next U.S. president will have to, effectively confront. We spoke to Taiwan's National Science and Technology Council Minister Wu Chen-wen about how the U.S. election may impact the island's chip production.
I don't worry about whether the Republic or the Democratic parties. I believe they will all agree on continuing the same direction. I don't worry too much about that.
Do you see that putting further pressure then on Taiwanese companies to expand production facilities in the US?
Well, it's an issue. I believe, yes. But in short term, maybe it's painful for the Taiwanese companies because it's more expensive, actually, if they move over there. But in the long run, maybe it's good for them. From my point of view, because they can improve themselves.
I do want to talk about the other areas for cooperation between the US and Taiwan, and drones has been highlighted as a particular area.
Yes.
Where would you look to partner?
We are working on a model that maybe we can establish a local supply chain here in Taiwan. From chips to other components and to the multi system. And we would like to work with the US based on the
更大的一些心理承受能力去承担目前市场出现的大幅波动的这样一些这个投资者。所以对于未来来说的话，可能更倾向于对于一些本身价值已经完全低估的，至少在目前来看的话，仍然价值低估的，可以从长线来看的话，这些个股也会走出一个慢牛的行情。所以说从这一点来看，市场其实目前它看脉络还是相对是比较清晰的。就是说市场在未来来看，
国内的专家真是全面，也不是说不能看，就是
长牛。这无论是管理层，还有包括机构，还有包括散户投资者，可能都是长期希望看。
那么大家都在说现在要进入
比较 biased
这样一个行情当中，那么板块的分化呢也是越来的越剧烈啊。那刚才呢，陶先生的观点是从更加长期的角度来看呢，他觉得比较看好的是大消费和
基本上是这个直播的前15到20分钟是中国的大 A 的消息，然后现在 CNBC 已经转到美国的这些银行，现在最近银行一是出了财报，二是好像还不错，然后
但从长期来看的话，它只能达到稳定。从长期来看的话，其实我们更愿意去寻找一些原先股息率比较高的，本身它的价值已经完全被低估的，净资产比较低的。因为我们知道从这次这个之前的这个新国九条，
彭博还在讲中国，
市场给到了很多这些政策，其实它有一些共通点。比如说前期新国九条特别提到，未来对于净资产低于1的，低于这个市净率低于1的一些个股，可能未来其实它就不能在市场上进行大幅的抛售，它的大股东就不能进行抛售。那其实从这一点本身给他们形成了一个定性，再加上目前市场未来希望能够长牛，引入长期资金，也就代表说完全低估的一些品种反而可能会被市场更多的去青睐。 特别是在市场进行到目前这样一个阶段，大家可能选择性已经并不是特别多，或者说已经进入到一个相对来说比较盲从的一个阶段，而盲目的阶段的时候，可能往往这样的个股可能它会更有一定的优势。所以我们说可能可以更多的去介入本身目前的确市场被低估的一些个股这些个股可能会更被市场能够看中。
另外，小先生，我们再来观察一个指标啊，就是成交量的这个变化。其实上周我们可以看到，这个成交量是非常的大的，已经到了3点几万亿了。但是突然呢，也是出现了一个大幅的萎缩。那我们知道，这个股价呢都是需要成交量的这样的一个支撑的。那如何看待量能的这样的一个萎缩呢？
上周的一个交投放大，或者说是一个必然的现象，因为国庆节之前，我们突然面临这个突然的上涨，或者说
大 A 的涨幅好像快被抹平了，
速度是非常快的，风格呢一下子就变成了牛市。原先我们第一天上涨，很多的一些投资者还是觉得这可能是个反弹并不是一些反转的情况。但是当我们上证指数涨幅超过20%的时候，大家会觉得这可能是一轮牛市行情。所以呢，很多的投资者呢，
今天看这个同花顺好像资金还是净流出，
整个市场或者说他们的一个心态是属于盲目跟。
Cyrus, if I can come in on the conversation as we digest all of the policy measures and the stimulus that China is trying to throw at the economy, one thing that we've also been focusing in on is they had suggested they were going to be offering ways for certain industries to merge and reorganize, and we're looking at this in the financial brokerage space. So if you also track the Chinese brokerages, the details from the Guotai Junan as well as Haitong Securities merger that finally came out, we saw a big spike in the shares. In terms of consolidation in the sector, do you expect it to see it in the banking space or in the brokerage space or across the insurance space? Your insights.
I'll tell you where we see growth, and therein there would be either a consolidation or maybe a divestment of sorts. The brokerage firms have only just picked up, as you know, Emily, being closer there in Hong Kong, and you've seen the activities take place in China and across the border, even in Hong Kong. So the pent up demand for wealth management, asset management, and brokerage has picked up significantly. There is a general awareness that this is where the market should be going. Banking consolidation, we missed that wave and that tide, I would say, a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, and thereafter. The banking sector
我其实不知道要不要把它推到退市上面，因为一般都是看什么小姐姐跳舞之类的，这种财经类的我不知道，或者打游戏的，这种类型都不知道有没有人看。
from WeChat expand their footprint.
可能就心血来潮搞一下。
A newcomer, a new digital bank, sort of like the Trust Bank and the Mox Bank of Singapore and Hong Kong, would they go after the Chinese or the North Asian consumer? Now that market is ripe and open. So that's what I think.
Cyrus, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. Cyrus Darwallace of IDC
一会儿好像还有国内的一个 briefing 还是一个 conference 发布会吧。
When you've got big legacy brands, trying to stay relevant, up to date, modern for the next generation is really important. We said from the start that everything that we do has to come from something that's really happened and from a kind of trend or from something that's really true. Because if it's true, it's going to be relatable, and if it's relatable, then we'll be able to build some kind of emotional connection. So we've been looking at kind of what problems exist in culture.
短期来看的话，因为这个在这个波动当中去寻找更多的机会，可能对于一些普通的投资者来说的话，它需要很大的一些技术和水平这个其实我们说是有一定的难度。 但是再从更远的一个方向来看的话，其实科技类会有一个难点是在于，很多科技类板块它最后可能，这个在整个竞争的角逐的过程当中会选出一个龙头，或者选出几个龙头。那很多的一些这个科技类板块，它可能在最终会被淘汰。所以它是一个长期和特别长期的一个过程。从整个长期来看的话，它有一定的这个可能会有一定的机会，但从特长期来看的话，可能最终一定选择一个龙头之后，会有一些个股会被淘汰掉。所以这个当中其实这个点是相对而言比较难把握的。当然，对于一些水平高的 短期的投资者，我认为说的确在这个市场当中，他可以选择到一定的机会，因为往往市场涨和跌，可能对于一些水平高的人他是最喜欢的，但是对于一些普通投资者可能没有太大的一些操作能力，
好，
难度非常高。
好，谢谢泰米先生解读。以上呢就是这个时段的市场零距离，稍事休息，马上回来。
油价、大宗商品都在下跌了，因为好像那个伊朗跟以色列的关系也没有干起来。现在真的最近行情，就像美国的市场都在高点，没有什么特别好的高低。
China is a very efficient country, so I'm not too worried. And in reality, there are ups and downs. We're here for the next 100 years.
市场瞬息万变，是谁洞悉未见？汇证财经，中国证监会首批核准成立的专业证券投资咨询机构之一，以投资智慧为本，以陪伴。
Today's Forex Update was sponsored by Interactive Brokers. Trade worldwide from a single unified platform.
财富未来，汇证财经，让投资更高效。
养发用蜂花，护发用蜂花，防脱发更要用蜂花。蜂花9增防脱洗发水。
好家伙，创业板好像已经跌下来了，是看来开盘之后有些资金在跑。
To me, ambition is drive. It's the fire in your belly. I didn't go to college right after high school.
.不知不觉已经播了半个小时了，很久没有播过那么久了，实在没什么人互动啊。
Here are your headlines. Asian markets mixed, but China stocks pick up steam despite scant details from the Ministry of Finance on the size and timing of much anticipated stimulus. Hong Kong shares playing catch up after a market holiday and lagging the region.
Another risk event, fresh trade data coming out from China due to drop today. Analysts expecting September export growth
to shore up the consumer, shore up the property market at least, and as well as helping a little bit those local governments, Dave.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time the State Council Information Office was this busy organizing press briefings. Yeah, PBOC, NDRC, Ministry of Finance, and there's one coming up in a couple of minutes, which will be including the NFRA,
我们切到彭博听一下。
SAMR and the MIIT and the Ministry of Justice. So yeah, we'll stay tuned for that and what they could say. In the meantime, the markets, as Yvonne is pointing out, is so you have two things. You have CSI 300 coming off highs a little bit. You have Hong Kong, which is just reopening today. You also have sector dispersion with the MSCI China should be coming up on your screens very, very shortly. You know, things like turnover, comparatively speaking, peaked mid last week. We've since come down, but certainly compared to the year-to-date averages, are still multiples above your year-to-date daily averages. We're looking at most sector groups down, with the exception of property and financials on your screens. That might be the brokerages, I could be mistaken. But as you can see, things like consumer staples, healthcare, IT, and discretionary are all leading these declines. Speaking of brokers, you have some.
现在开盘半个小时了，基本上整个大 A 行情都已经转头掉下了。
To see more capitalization,
刚刚是创业板嘛，创业板现在是跌在1.17%，上证50、沪深300都是水下。可能还是会跳到接近3000，这个位置要踩一下可能。
The global bull market has some decent momentum. I think we're up 5 weeks in the last 6. See it, the S&P 500. A good example of that is up for 5 straight weeks. As far as that's concerned,
as far as stimulus is concerned, and some of the pledges with regards to what they're going to do with regards to issuance of special treasury bonds, helping out the real estate market, and also trying to address some of the risks around debt.
北京时间的上午10点，美国西部时间的晚上7点，我们再播个半个小时、1个小时，然后反正周日晚上。
The National People's Congress, which will be meeting at the end of the month, and by then, hopefully, we will get some idea of how much fiscal stimulus they're likely to chuck at the economy with regards to helping out the demand side. Given it has so far looked very encouraging on the supply side, but whether they will address some of the consumption trends as well. Speaking of that,
看一下有没有人往退市场推财经类。
inflation cooling. Actually, that was the slowest in 3 months. Producer deflation deepening. So the deflationary pressures continuing to mount in China. So hopefully, some of this fiscal stimulus that's now being announced will stabilize those prices moving forward. And then, of course, we do have those trade numbers coming out this morning in the morning session. Hopefully, if they do press the button over in Beijing with the exports and imports, they
中国9月份的 inflation CPI 0.4， PPI 负的2点几，这个基本上就是在要通缩了呀，这个。
Slightly encouraging for those future exports, but we'll have to wait and see what those headlines tell us.
比如中央财政还有较大的举债空间和赤字提升空间。
听听第一财经，听听这个国内媒体怎么说。
增量政策举措，财政部将发行特别国债支持国有大型商业银行补充资本。 下一步将继续坚定的精准施策，靶向发力，改善居民收入预期，激发消费潜能，用好专项资金、贷款贴息等工具，带动有效投资，扩大国内需求。在截止到10月9号的1周之内 ，EPFR 跟踪的所有新兴市场股票基金净流入达到409亿美元，而这个趋势是由中国股票基金的资金流入所领引。 中国股票市场见证了约390亿美元的资金的流入，再度创下历史新高。
恒生科技
境内投资
下跌4%，恒指下跌2%。
EFPR 分析说，市场对于中国股市反弹的投资热情高涨，这些新资金的涌入是之前单周记录的2倍多，也使得 EPFR 跟踪的新兴市场股票基金的整体流入额创下了新高。 这是中国股票基金单周流入额连续第2周创下历史纪录。在近期强势反弹的行情当中，大量的资金借助 ETF 入市。从规模变动情况来看，科创芯片等主题 ETF 的规模猛增，短短几个交易日，部分科创 ETF 规模骤增60-70倍。 尽管国庆假期之后市场有所回调，但是和9月份行情启动之前的相比，依然有不小的涨幅。在赚钱效应驱动之下，资金也快速的开始挪移了。跨境 ETF 债券基金遭赎回，股票 ETF 是持续的获得申购。在周末举办的2024年中国移动全球合作伙伴大会上，来自不同领域的企业们带来了推进信息技术融合创新服务，全方位展示各行业在 AI 和5G等数字领域的创新成果。
新网络呢，可以做到7乘24小时，包括这个环境的监测，包括应急事件的这个监测，大量的降低。
I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty going on, right? It's still 50-50 whether Trump is going to be in the House or Harris is going to be in the House. So I think there's a bit of that like thinking going on as well as to observing what's going on in the U.S. political space. I mean, before actually coming out with the next round, very, very concrete kind of big-scale stimulus. And I think we have to take that into account.
It's probably fair to say, there's a big group of investors who missed the initial rally in China, waited out and see how things settled. What's your advice to those people who missed out? Do they get back in? Do they wait for more clarity? Do they wait for a dip? Or is this all in at this point?
Yeah, it's been a phenomenal rally, right? We've seen a 30% plus rally, and for property sector over like 100% plus in a very, very short time. Now, we kind of dissect what's been happening. A lot of that was actually short covering. There's a bit of rotation for long funds into the more kind of economically sensitive sectors. So that's what's been going on. I think as far as we understand, when we kind of look at the data in terms of long-term position investors, a lot of them are still underweight. And there's still a lot of money on the sideline, kind of looking at how Chinese policies will pan out and how economic data will pan out as well. So for us, I mean, we've been market weight since April, but I mean, we're also waiting for kind of the more details about fiscal, because I think that's, I mean, that will really signal whether or not we can get more positive on earnings for next year. And I think that's the key to kind of longer-term investors. And Chang, maybe you can chime in on just what else is still needed. I mean, you look at the inflation numbers that we got over the weekend, and we're still very much seeing that deflation is very entrenched, in fact, even more in September. Have we heard enough to at least see a change in how inflationary pressures are going to go?
At this point, we heard enough in terms of the direction and clearly.
现在我们在听的是彭博这边的右上角的视频源。
Headline figures and specific how and where the government is going to put the money. We know
Property
the
stock
government will
还是
have to continue to do the usual the thing China's good at, big projects, etc. But at the same time, we do see the need for the government to support demand, both in terms of consumption and investment. And again, the signals are there, but we don't have sufficient information yet to gauge to what extent the focus is starting to shift. So that's on the sort of spending side, but there will have to be the housing side, we just talked about the government is thinking about stabilizing the market, property market, but for us it's more about stabilizing transaction. Unlike some investors expect to as if to get
资金现在流出了88亿了，开盘现在45分钟左右，大资金还在跑啊，可能得到下一个支撑位踩一下之后，然后再资金入场。美股上的这几个 ADR、ETF、FXI、MSHI 基本上都是在跌2%、3%了 ，KYB 跌4%。我可以一会儿看一下这个美卡论坛几个华人论坛上面的小伙伴都怎么说。
In terms of the kind of that downside, I mean, it's clearly that there's of course there's the Fed put that we've been talking about, but now there's also a Chinese policy put. And I think if you look at the kind of tools that Chinese government can still deploy, there's still quite a number of tools that they haven't pulled out. So I think from that side, obviously the downside is much more protected right now. Now, we've had like I guess if you look at the equity market right now, price to earnings ratio have rebounded back to sort of historical average. So from here onwards, I mean, the upside really depends on the earnings outlook for not just this year, but also next year. So far, I think we've seen some recovery in terms of Chinese earnings, but still, if you look at kind of 3 to 4 year trend, it's been down. And to change that kind of entrenched trend, I think we need to see much more fiscal. And the fiscal detail is actually quite important.
Twitch 上面大部分都是一些 crypto 直播。
But I guess investors have been conditioned to fade these stimulus because a lot of them are actually supply driven, and it doesn't resolve the problem of consumer confidence. So that's why I think this time around, if we can see kind of much more direct stimulus on the demand side, on the consumption side, that would send a very, very forceful signal. And I think that's what we're looking at for. It seems like investors are quick to chase the consumption side in this market. Yes. Would you continue to chase? Yeah, I think if you look at some of the Chinese consumer names, they're not too expensive and they're at a discount to global peers. So I think for those companies, it's actually worth paying a lot more attention.
Joshua, bring you back in. What starts to improve the economy? Like, what are the first indicators that might be the first to respond to everything we've heard so far? I mean, we heard from Goldman Sachs, they bumped up their growth forecast. I'm not sure if you guys are ready to do that as well, but just map out the indicators to watch moving forward.
人工智能服务大模型近200个，注册用户超过6亿。好的，以上就是这一时段的市场面和公司面的消息。
第一财经怎么搞了一个 AI 来播新闻？
请扫我左侧的2维码。下面继续市场零距离的其他节目。好，接
下来呢，进入到我们今天的焦点资讯。进入到10月份 ，A 股公司呢是迎来了2024年前3季度的业绩预告的披露高峰。10月13日晚间，有9家公司呢发布了前3季度的业绩预告，其中呢，乐新科技、上海电力等5家公司预增，2家扭亏，业绩预喜公司呢是扎堆的出现。据统计呢，截止到10月13日晚间，已经有115家上市公司呢是披露了2024年前3季度的业绩预告，其中呢63家公司预增，11家公司呢扭亏为盈，19家公司略增，预喜
Chinese state bonds. We've added sovereigns in there because again we see a decent opportunity there, both in terms of the currency, but also in terms of the fact that at some point we think PBOC is going to have to kind of capitulate on trying to defend the interest rate floor, and I think the interest rate floor is going to be reset lower.
人民币美元CNY 7.07，离岸人民币7.08。1年后预期到6.9、6.8。人民币在升值的通道啊。
Which we still like, but they're just not as compelling as they were when they were 25% cheaper into some state bonds.
What about regional rotation, Paul? How are you looking at broader EM off the back of expectations that if we do see a sort of comeback, particularly with the Chinese consumer, what that's going to mean, broadly for Asia, but also, of course, given some of the interest and some of the money that's been pouring back into China. We were just speaking to Cyrus, who was saying that $100 he'd be going 60 China.
Yeah. So look, I think obviously China is the elephant in the room for the regional story. So whatever happens in China, good China is good for the region, and struggling China is obviously very bad for the region.
沪深300好像拉起来了。
It's difficult to see any really compelling stories, regionally, that would make you want to take exposure there rather than to China itself. So
好像真的，我群里边频道群里的小伙伴有看到的。
We'd rather get the kind of core story rather than the spin-offs, as it were. And also, I think that the global story is more likely to impact the rest of the region. As I was saying with China, it's very much that domestic consumption story that we're interested in. Yes, that can have spin-offs for the region, but I think it's more of a mixed message. If we look at Thailand, for instance, we've seen a huge recovery in tourism here, and a lot of that has been on the back of Chinese tourist arrivals. So there's still some opportunity in sectors like that, but more broadly, I think the region is still. It's still got massive trading balances with the West, with Europe, and with the States. So
现在在说其他一些新兴市场，我们就不再听 CNBC 了。
转向情绪转向质量，也就基本面。那同时，像前2-3年比较火热的红利，可能一定程度上会分流出给成长板块。所以这个阶段，投资者关注这个季报窗口，关注一些有基本面支撑的一些标的比较重要。主持人。
那么接下来就这个话题呢，我们再来和棚内的2位嘉宾一起来探讨一下。蒋一凡先生，刚才呢邓先生也提到了这个3季报的即将披露，可能会带动成长股的一些的行情，您的观点是什么呢？
对，从今年整体的这个基本面的情况来看，确实是科技这一块表现相对比较好啊，尤其是一些科技制造业像电子里面的半导体面板呀、元件呀等等这些确实业绩不错。然后呢，还有像计算机板块里面的一些计算机硬件，还有通信硬件，表现都相对比较好的。但科技成长里面呢，它的其他一些方向可能就相对要弱一些，像软件还有传媒它可能还是在底部偏右侧的这样一个位置，就还没有完全起来。看其他5大方向的话，大概 目前所处的位置是这样的，就金融地产和医药呢，目前是处于底部区域就整体基本面在底部区域，然后周期那块已经慢慢脱离底部在底部偏右侧的这样一个位置尤其是周期里面全球定价的一些品种，像有色金属、石油石化、化工这些已经慢慢脱离底部在右侧了。但是国内定价的一些品种可能还是在底部徘徊，像建材钢铁煤炭等等然后呢刚才讲科技是最好的，然后呢就是两个相对表现比较弱一些的大方向就可能它的基本面还在加速赶底的这样一个过程当中一个是消费，还有一个是先进制造业先进制造业主要是那个新能源还有军工这样一些板块。
好，那其实呢，刚才我
没有办法推到国内推到国内这些 CNBC 跟彭博的分分钟的直播员就给掐掉了。
职业、汽车零部件、化工等行业的景气度呢，也是明显提升那么蔡景先生如何看待这些行业和板块的后市的发展呢？
其实从这个前期本身的这个个股的一些轮动来看的话，的确这些行业它本身就在市场的一个市场上涨的一个过程当中，其实都是受益的特别是在我们这轮牛市还没有完全起来的情况下其实这些个股其实走的总体来说也算不错因为一直在轮动的板块当中这也基本上就是从预期上来看的话其实在预期当中已经走完了。那我们可以看到，其实最近的市场其实会稍微有点不一样。为什么？因为前期涨了那么多近期出现一定的回落。但是像这样的行业，经常在中报的时候会显现出来其实这个总的业绩可能会高于预期或者说这个从比起。
佩驰这玩意儿怎么还有广告呀？
是环比也好还是同比也好可能都会有一定程度的一个上升所以可能在市场当中都会给予一定的机会。但是我认为说市场如果说在目前整个来说进入到像目前的上涨和下跌的一个阶段来说的话可能它都会有一定的轮动性所以说完全说这个板块在未来它到底有多少的机会，或者说可能在它的周期会有所不同但是我认为这些板块可能在每个周期的过程当中可能都会存在机会。
好，我们再来关注一下这个时段市场的即时的变化的情况上证指数目前是上涨0.01%，深圳成指呢下跌0.40%，科创50指数呢下跌2.04%，创业板指呢是下跌1.08%，沪深300指数呢下跌0.05%，上证50指数呢目前是上涨0.20%。蒋一帆先生如何观察今天 A 股早盘的这样的一个盘面的情况？我们看到双创指数呢这个下跌的幅度是略微大的。
那从今天早盘情况来看呢，我觉得早盘不是上冲了一下嘛？我觉得对于周末的这个财政部的发布会应该说还是一个比较正面的一个反馈但最近呢，我们看到就全球的这个一些事件又开始我们看到又频频的出现像那个美联储那边11月份降不降息会降25呢，还是说就停一下了这个都不知道的。然后呢，我们看到全球的一些
冲高回落
事件性的这个冲击呢，又慢慢开始这一点呢，我觉得可能对
现在第一财经也开始去讨论这个
角度来看，我觉得大的
国际市场
已经形成，我觉得这个是没有太大疑问的
See kind of goods inflation picking up. And if you look at the latest inflation number from the US, I mean, services inflation is still quite sticky, right? You've still got that part to work through. So as we look forward, I think there's a bit of an interesting tangle between US and Chinese policies. Of course, I mentioned that China has been very, very patient to wait for the Fed cut to start their easing cycle. But also, I mean, the Fed would be looking at data, right? It would be looking at inflation data as well. So the more China eases, I mean, perhaps the more difficult it is for inflation to come off. And I mean, that gives less room for the Fed to cut. So again, this is kind of, I think there's a balance between the two.
So what's the implication for risky assets, as Dave mentioned, or even asset classes that you look at? Can equities continue this bull run?
Yeah, I mean, that at the end of the day, you need to look at the growth environment. Yeah. We're definitely not in a recession, at least for the kind of next 6 to 12 months. And if you rule out the risk of a recession, equities tend to do quite well, right, in these environments. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's probably not a straight line up, right? You would have like some of these pullbacks, 5%, 10% pullbacks, as we're witnessing, for example, in China markets today, right? You have expectations of policies. The policies actually would take time to come out, therefore the market kind of pull back. So I think for investors, I mean, these are actually not bad environments because you would get pullbacks to add on to positions or to kind of sectors or names that you like.
Right.
So I mean, I think over the medium term we're still quite positive, but just kind of there would be kind of these market pullbacks.
So add on weakness, but add what on weakness? What's your advice? Because you just mentioned there, add names that investors like. What are names investors should be liking?
So I think I think in the U.S., for example, the cyclical sectors are where kind of we like. You see kind of consumer discretionary names kind of breaking out. Financials are doing quite well. Industrials are doing well.
Indeed, really focusing on is if we get some kind of really messy, unclear outcome, if we get legal challenges and all the kind of shenanigans that you might expect if this election doesn't go the way that Trump wants, for instance. So it could that could be a third possibility, and that could actually be in the short term that could be messy. Anything else, I don't think creates a short-term problem. I think the markets are pretty blasé about whether it's Harris or Trump in the short term, irrespective of all the Trump rhetoric.
Yeah, Paul, so that's, of course, U.S. and China, but what about U.S. and Taiwan? Something that's happening over, we're watching these Chinese war games around Taiwan this morning that just got started, and we're getting reporters reporting that the U.S. Biden administration saying that there's no justification for military exercises and pressure campaigns in response to a routine annual speech. And that was President Lai Ching-te's speech for its double 10th day, that is Taiwan's national day. The impact on Taiwan, what would you say, Harris or Trump, and are you keeping track of these Chinese war games? We don't really know how long it's going to go on for.
Absolutely. It's a major worry. It's a real sign that the Biden administration has massively ramped up the tensions, the geopolitical tensions globally.
有一个小伙伴来留言了，盲猜进入300的保值，可能会到300来猜，到3000来猜一下。来回复一下。
Paul, thank you very much for your time today. We've been speaking with Paul Gamble from MBMG Family Office Group. We are just a few weeks away from the U.S. election, as we've been talking about. Is there still time for an October surprise? We'll tell you more when we come back.
Southeast Asia is soaring from its government.
再看一眼行情。A 股的这些中证股龄、沪深300还都是在下跌的，香港也是，香港差不多在跌2.7%，然后再看一下美国的这个 ADR 的夜盘，都在跌2.7%、3%左右。
机构，周五呢，该股再度20厘米涨停，换手率超过60%，卖出席当中依旧有4家机构，合计净卖出超过1亿元。科马科技的先进陶瓷材料零部件主要是用于半导体的制造前道工序，它已经覆盖刻蚀、薄膜沉积、离子注入、光刻等。而光刻机、涂胶显影设备领域，公司的境内的代表性的客户就包括知名的企业上海微电子、科艺宏源、新源微。
做半导体器件的。
机器人概念股明治电器上周五跌停，机构大幅度卖出超过1亿元。而明治电器上半年的净利润4002.86万，
From voting day in the United States, and the race is still too close to call in many key battleground states. NBC's Aaron Gilchrist reports.
23 days until Election Day, and both former President Trump and Vice President Harris are on the campaign trail almost daily now.
We have some hard work ahead of us, but we like hard work.
This, as a new NBC News national poll of registered voters shows the presidential contest deadlocked at 48%. The poll shedding light on the gender gap between the candidates, Harris ahead with women by 14 points, and more men supporting Trump by 16 points. The vice president in battleground...
Welcome back. Here are some of the stories we're following this Monday morning in the Asia Pacific. China and the EU have failed to reach an agreement here on the bloc's planned EV tariffs. It's after 8 rounds of negotiations. Now, China's Commerce Ministry says that significant disagreements remain, and it wants the EU to send a technical team as soon as possible for further talks.
现在是西部时间晚上7点半，北京时间的上午10点半。
Its own tariffs on European dairy, brandy, pork, and also cars. Now, Chinese EV maker BYD is working on its strategy to woo European buyers. The vice president of the company, executive vice president Stella Lees, told the newspaper that the company may initially offer EVs in Germany for about $27,000 to $32,000. And the plan comes after the EU this month voted to impose tariffs of as much as 45% on EVs.
And we're watching those EVs this morning as well. There was a bit of what China mentioned about major disagreements when it comes to those EU EV tariffs. This is Bloomberg.
大 A 这个刺激方案具体的钱不出来，可能还是不会有什么比较明显的反弹吧。现在都是在温水煮青蛙。
2021年到去年分别实现55.5亿、49.18亿、49.26亿，分别同比下降29%、11%和同比增长0.16%。而上半年中游资本的净利润30.45亿，同比下降22.07%。高位强势股呢，之前是掀起了跌停潮，其中的任何软件是 跌停。那么根据数据显示，任何软件呢是多路知名游资频繁的进出。好的，以上是最新的龙虎榜数据的解读，我们把时间交给刘季。
好，谢谢朱勇的梳理。那以上呢就是这个时段的市场零距离，稍事休息，马上回来。
爱学习的股民，股票学习机来了，专业陪伴。
股票学习机，有人说专家需要用一下这个。
My ambition is to help the viewer connect the dots, to understand the context, so that we, all of us, can actually make our own judgments. Oh, I love what I do. I can't imagine doing anything else.
Ambition doesn't always look like you think it might look. I can remember reading The Economist on my lacrosse bus trips in college. I've just always been super fascinated by what's happening in financial markets.
11:29 a.m. in Tokyo. Japanese markets are shut here this morning, so we're focusing on that reopen in Hong Kong as well, where we are seeing extended declines when it comes to what the H-share market is doing. It seems like A is winning in some ways, but then again, we are seeing things lose a bit of momentum. We talk about turnover. I think we're talking about 500 billion RMB of turnover, which is basically, I think, less than half of what we've been seeing the past week or so. So certainly we are seeing maybe that disappointment seep in a little bit, but Asia ex Japan is looking like this here right now. We're slightly down. U.S. futures are also slightly down this morning, Dave.
Yeah, well, things couldn't have gone up in a vertical line. You know, we front-loaded a ton of turnover and price action in the initial 2 weeks or so. So I guess that's good to let it simmer a little bit right now. And as I guess I'm pointing out, right, so we wait for pullbacks here. We are expecting to see a further weakness and consolidation in many of these markets while we wait for more information on whether the economy does respond, of course, to everything that's been mentioned so far. Just a recap of what some of our guests have been saying about Saturday's finance ministry briefing. Have a look.
It is clear that they're just tackling some of the structural issues. They're not really looking to massively inject, so it does not constitute a whatever it takes moment, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think what we've heard is a positive longer term. Short term, I think maybe see some downside here.
In terms of direction, it was very, very on spot. However, it was not upfront in terms of the amount of the new issuance of central government debt. For that, it needs the NPC, National People's Congress, to support them.
And I think to have a swap of the local government debt that will ease the accounts receivable pressure in that whole ecosystem, which has been worsening based on the financial data. So I think structurally it looks fine. Short term, it is not as satisfying.
For more context on these market moves this Monday morning, our Asia equities reporter Charlotte Yang is here with us on set to talk us through. So prices are down, turnover is coming down a little bit compared to last week. What does that tell you?
Yeah, I think this morning is a lot of volatility. And so far, I think to us, it shows that market hasn't really reached a consensus in terms of how much fiscal wealth Chinese government has to support the economy. So basically, you have two camp of investors. One that is more, slightly more positive, looking at the positive tone from the Ministry of Finance and the positive guidance saying that, we have room to raise those deficit. But today it looks like the more risk-on traders are gaining the upper hand, looking at the lack of like a clear figure going forward. And also we have a bunch of
CNBC 还在回播周六的那个财政部的视频。
to figure out to get more details in terms of how much figure we'll see from Chinese government in terms of fiscal support to the economy.
基本上目前看，今天的大 A 的行情就是冲高回落了，然后港股那边除了短暂的到过水上之外，就基本上在下跌2%左右。
And also we do have more like briefings coming out from the government, including today as well. So I think for now, a lot of investors are choosing just to stand on the sidelines and see, especially for the longer term investors, to have a better gauge of.
有人说3000的时候再来推机接后。
All right. Charlotte Ping and Charlotte Yang, our Bloomberg Asia equities reporter, on the latest when it comes to where the Chinese market is going as well. We're taking a look at property stocks in particular here. They were actually rallying at the get-go of this open, and looks like we've reversed most of those gains here this morning. Shimao property down some 5%. We're keeping an eye, of course, after Beijing promised new measures to support the sector. Let's bring in Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst Christy Hung. She's with us now. Yeah, what's your take on this MOF briefing and the support that we heard that could be coming from the property sector?
Yes, I think compared to the central bank, which came out with more forceful steps earlier, and the Politburo comments that showed greater determination to stop the slump for housing market in China, the Ministry of Finance support is underwhelming.
镓这样的小金属，还有像林业、水泥、房地产的相关板块以及化债板块都还是走势比较不错目前涨幅都在2%以上，包括了一些银行类个股的一个情况。跌幅榜当中呢是上市次日新股，还有呢券商板块今天早盘呢明显的有所走低，领跌市场，整体板块跌幅在3%以上。另外旅游零售还有像一些连锁医美包括饮料乳品半导体板块现在是跌幅居前的。我们来看一看
国内板块虽然是不懂，只敢买大盘。
涨幅榜当中呢，看到的是国科军工、新研软件信达地产等等，都是封住涨停。像四川金鼎、长城军工这个宝变电器等渝农商行现在都大涨3%以上，7%以上的这样的一些标的。好，我们再来看一看呢，在跌幅榜当中的一些个股的情况。
Local government, but I think the market would have to see more to read, especially in the further details and the size and the pace of such fiscal easing in the coming weeks to determine what they really have in terms of how they really want to gauge the impact on the financial markets.
Yeah, that likely to come with the National People's Congress Standing Committee in order to rubber stamp approve any financial figure for the stimulus. As we look to some of the data that we're going to be getting, of course, it'll be trade numbers today and the Q3 GDP coming out on Friday. What is your expectation?
Well, I think Q3, if we look at Q3, we have really seen quite a bit of data disappointment in July and August. The CPI inflation and the PPI inflation released yesterday, they're also showing that the deflation pressures is indeed quite present in China, prompting all these latest policy easing moves that we have seen from the Chinese government as well as the PBOC. I think for trade data, it has been quite resilient and being a very important growth driver for China's growth so far this year. I think if we look at the data, it could still remain relatively outperforming compared to some of the domestic indicators like IP or retail sales. We are expecting export growth to be at around 7% in year-on-year terms in this month. So that would be higher than less than 5% of IP growth and less than 3% of retail sales growth. But that said, we do think that the Chinese government has a great incentive to really introduce more of the measures to manage the downside risk, because mainly coming from the domestic factors, as it becomes increasingly quite difficult to counting on external demand, especially given the major risks upcoming, i.e. the U.S. elections. So that we are going to see more of the continued gauge of the Chinese government on the latest data. In terms of GDP growth, I think latest data are indeed showing more of the easing growth momentum in Q3 from Q2. We are looking at 4.6% in year-on-year terms. Compared to 4.7%. We have been forecasting China's GDP growth for 2024 at about 4.7%. With the latest policy easing measures, we do see some modest upside risk. That said, if you look at the latest Ministry of Finance easing, as well as some of the more easing signals from previously PBOC, Politburo, and the NDRC, there is still a sense of lack of imminent stimulus on the consumption. That is why we are currently only seeing very rather modest growth upside risk.
沪深300翻红了，沪深300跟中证500已经基本上从下跌这种回来了。
When do you believe we could start to see that transmission and translating into real demand? I mean, do you have any sort of quarter in mind as to when we could start to see a meaningful pickup?
Well, I think this year it seems like that the mutual finance is trying to accelerate the fiscal easing using existing resources. For example, like utilizing various fiscal funds available, as well as only could potentially a modest increase in net government bond issuance, which we are projecting in the range of 0.4 to 1 trillion in RMB, while it continues to focus on some of the existing issues like tackling the property and the
the economy will continue growing next year and the year after, and how can the economy recover from its current problem? The current problem has major problem in one thing, that is local governments are running out of cash. Local governments have been using short-term debt and loans to finance 20-year, 30-year infrastructure projects.
有人说在跟美联储硬扣，其实觉得不是，因为它毕竟是，尤其大 A 的话是印人民币来刺激嘛，其实还是只要上面收益，它的自由度还是很大的，而且没有特别多的汇率的限制。如果对比的话，其实想做的话，能跟20年的3月份的美联储的印钱呢，能做到差不多的。
By the way, the Chinese central government is by far the richest central government in the world, holding shares of the most profitable commercial banks and the 3 most profitable mobile phone operators. There's no reason for the central government not to issue a huge amount of debt to help out local governments and in turn to help out macro economy.
Take us into where you think the overall budget deficit should be. So all things included, central government budget deficit, local government spending, how big should a fiscal hole be next year and the year after to get China's economy out of this deflationary spiral?
Well, to give you a very quick answer, I truly believe a 3% deficit, at most 5% will be more than enough. But my key point is that this is the wrong question. This is the wrong question.
3200点，这位置的分歧还是挺大的。
The current income and current expenditure of the central government, and that we call the gap is deficit or surplus. What we are needing, what the central government needs to do, is to manage the asset part, the asset liability account of the central government. The central government of China holds lots of assets in stock market listed companies such as the 6 most profitable commercial banks. Meanwhile, the central government holds very little, only 25% at most of GDP in terms of debt. So there's a tremendous amount of net equity for the central government. What the central government should do is to issue more liability, issue more debt, and use the money to swap out, to buy local government assets in the form of infrastructure projects. So this is a capital account management. This is in a sense of the company in the paraphrasing the company's language. This is a merger and acquisition (M&A) operation. This is not spending your capital expenditure. This is not about the current account. This is about asset management. So I truly believe we economists have to really restudy public finance. We need to have a new mentality, a new framework to explain this to the policymakers and to the business people, to the general public.
That was David Dao Gui, their Tsinghua University director and former PBOC advisor, speaking to us a bit earlier in the show. Still ahead, Taiwan's government tells Bloomberg TSMC is planning more European factories with a focus on AI. We're here exclusively from the tech minister Wu Chengwen. Next.
台积电鸡贼得很，中美两边横跳，又要去霍霍欧洲了。沪深300已经
Well, Boeing embarks on a major cost-cutting effort, including axing 17,000 jobs, which it says will help stem the widening losses.
那所以呢，就银行整体来看呢，就净息差目前已经是处于一个相对比较低的位置啊。那么估算啊，就可能到明年下半年吧，或者到后年，它可能会达到一个相对比较平衡的一个水平啊。比方说在1.5%或者1.6%左右，达到一个平衡，甚至有些银行它可能会开始有一个回升啊。所以对于银行这个基本面来讲呢，我认为就大概率就现在还是在那个低位啊。
夜盘呢，其实深度比较差。
大概半年到1年左右的时间啊，我觉得大概率是能够看到基本面回升的。
好，今天跟大家来分享的行业研报呢是关于银行板块。银行板块是在这波行情当中的一个非常明显的中流砥柱。那么在市场这个风格切换的时候呢，经常一些红利板块呢就开始有很明显的一个突出的一个表现。银行板块呢在这个里边呢就起到很重要的作用。那么也是临近到了业绩的公布的一个集中期，是大家关注银行板块呢从营收包括净利来看呢都是对比中报有这样的一个改善。同时净息差目前在低位，但接下来呢可能会经过一个震荡平衡的过程，有一个止跌的回稳。好，下面呢我们就来跟踪一下银行板块的及时的一些数据面、基本面方面的情况，再来连线一下朱勇。你好，朱勇。
板块是从2023年以来走的最强的。
我们的直播已经来了1个小时20分钟，
甚至有很多个股都走出了翻倍的行情。而今年以来，银行板块仍然走势较强。截止到上周五的收盘，银行指数由年初的4419.75点上涨到6000点以上。
What else did we hear in that exclusive interview of yours?
Yeah, we certainly got a lot of colour from Minister Wu about TSMC and its outlook plans. Of course, at TSMC, you mentioned being the world's biggest chip maker, you would expect the government to be in very close communication with them about helping them to maintain that competitive edge. We know that TSMC has already broken ground on a new facility in Dresden in Germany. That's to produce chips mainly for the automotive sector, so the automotive sector chips are not the most advanced ones. Taiwan has kept the most high-tech components still on the island. Of course, it faces a lot of pressure to push that elsewhere around the world as well. For his part, Minister Wu has indicated that TSMC perhaps has further expansion plans in Europe. TSMC, we spoke to about that as well, saying that they've still got their current investment plans in place. They don't have any further ones at this stage, but still, here's what Minister Wu told us. Remember, of course, he is someone who has very close communication with that company.
I don't worry about whether the Republic or the Democratic parties. I believe that they will all agree on continuing the same direction. I don't worry too much about that.
Do you see that putting further pressure then on Taiwanese companies to expand production facilities in the US?
Well, it's an issue. I believe, yes. But in short term, maybe it's painful for the Taiwanese companies because it's more expensive, actually, if they move over there. But in the long run, maybe it's good for them, from my point of view, because they can improve themselves.
I do want to talk about the other areas for cooperation between the US and Taiwan, and drones has been highlighted as a particular area.
Drones? Yes.
Where would you look to partner?
We are working on a model that maybe we can establish a local supply chain here in Taiwan, from chips to other components and to the modules, the system. And we would like to work with the US based on the innovative systems that have been developed in the US, because in the past we don't have this kind of industry.
China has really established a lead in the drone market for a variety of different uses.
Right, we know that.
How long is it going to take for Taiwan to catch up, and can it catch up, do you think?
关于银行板块的最新的数据面的情况就是这些，我们把时间交给小智。
好的，谢谢朱勇，和大家跟踪一下银行板块以及相关的一些板块当中个股的变化情况。我们来看一下指数，银行板块的指数呢，目前整体上表现还是比较的突出，涨幅达到了2.69%。就像刚才朱勇梳理的这些数据可以看到，银行板块呢是今年以来非常强势的一个板块。那么走势呢也是相对的一个震荡走升比较的独立的一个板块。在现在的个股当中呢，像一些城农商行的走势是比较的突出，还有一部分股份制银行呢是紧随其后的，大行的涨幅呢相对偏小。现盘中来看是与农商行涨在最前面。我们看一下。与农商行现在涨幅呢达到6.6%左右，今天早盘是跳空高开的，而且股价也创了这个新高，突破了前期的高点。我们再看一下江苏银行，也是在盘中今天早盘的走势领涨达到了5.02%。重庆银行在板块里边呢也是表现突出的，涨幅达5.02%。贵阳银行、沪农商行、成都银行、宁波银行等现在都涨幅比较的靠前。好，那么关于银行板块的一些实时的情况我们就交流到这儿，看一看盘面的变化。现在从指数方面来看的话，回稳上涨的指数开始有所增多，只有双创指数呢还是在绿盘，创业板指数的跌幅也是有所收窄。我们来看一下大盘的即时的表现，沪市的综合指数最新是3235点，上涨了0.55%，成交呢是3450亿元。来看看深成指，深圳方面，目前指数是10094点，涨幅呢是0.33%，是小于沪市综合指数的一个拉升幅度，成交4516亿。现在呢是上午10点51分两市的成交金额到目前呢是 900亿，也就是在8000亿这样的一个水平上。从分类指数来看呢，权重比较的活跃沪深300上证50呢都是红盘上涨。
对，
现在创业
沪深300跟上证50确实今天比较强一点。
指数呢是2089点，但是成交是在2382亿。从这一段的板块的整体的变化来看，这个军工板块仍然是表现最为突出的像地面兵装成飞概念、航空装备、者家都是涨幅比较居前。另外呢，就是水泥概念，还有一些民爆概念。今天早盘的这个一些化债方向都走的是非常的活跃的。在银行板块当中，我们也看到整体的涨幅呢是2.5%以上。但是今天早盘的券商板块呢，则是明显的有所走低，还有一些旅游零售板块还有半导体板块，今天早盘乳业板块，在前几天有所活跃情况下今天早盘也是跌幅居前。那我们就盘中的一些情况呢，也和这个互动平台上观众的问题结合起来交流一下。那有观众就感觉到，在整体大金融比较活跃的状态之下，反而
感觉好像这个大盘似乎今天站住了在3200点
牛市旗手的这样的一个所谓板块，为什么在现阶段出现在一个跌幅榜前列？除了今天的2个龙头的
不知道能不能跌回3000点
复牌之后的这个涨停，还有什么其他一些因素让有观众对这个话题很感兴趣？今天讲一下看法。
再看一下大资金的方向。
再大的牛市，再大的旗手，你总也不能天天涨吧，对吧？你总归你涨了一段，总归要回档的吧？你天天涨，这个就我在历史上至少从来没有看到过。就可能有些朋友就比较
大资金跑了200多亿
作为一个旗手的板块风向标应该就始终领涨比大盘涨得要多。其实我觉得这种认知可能要稍微扭转一下就是涨多了的板块要跌滞涨的板块要补涨，这个其实在在一波行情里面，这个都是非常正常的现象。包括我们看到今天领涨的板块，像那个我看有军工还有那个水泥建材，对吧？还有那个我看那个建筑好像也慢慢起来，这个很明显就是在之前的这个行情里面滞涨的这些品种我觉得现在都慢慢起来。就在一波上涨当中就是你如果说只单靠一个板块或者1-2个板块冲在前面，就只靠这2个板块涨，那其实就跟当时那个19年到21年那个时候行情有点像，就只有那个核心资产和那个新能源2个板块涨其他所有的品种全部都不涨，甚至还是跌的。那这种行情呢，我觉得可能对于市场的长远的这种发展来讲，可能就不是特别有利吧。那我觉得这个板块里面内部能有个有序的轮动之前券商、半导体现在轮到一些滞涨的什么银行建筑这个挺好我觉得那等到这波券商调的可能差不多到位了这个市场获利盘基本上都已经走了不少了那它慢慢企稳之后。我觉得像说的一个下一步
resilience have not changed. Now, the article says that as long as China has confidence and implements precise policies, its economic development will continue. And meanwhile, the Securities Times sees the Chinese Financial Ministry briefing on Saturday, boosting investors' confidence in domestic and capital markets. They spoke with analysts who say the briefing did buoy market confidence, with some seeing the bull market for China continuing.
Yeah, and what we probably are seeing right now is maybe just this period of consolidation.
对，沪深基本上都已经
an opportunity to add more exposure to some of the nations that might have raced too quickly ahead.
看一下香港，香港现在是跌1%，之前跌2%，下跌收窄。
To the downside here, most of course of these constituents are here in Hong Kong, where markets are reopening after a long weekend. The brokers are in focus here for various reasons, one of which, of course, is turnover picking up. It's coming back down a little bit, relatively speaking. There's also the big story out of CICC and it being investigated by the securities regulator. And separately, Hai Tong and Guo Taijun, and of course, were limit up, past tense. In China earlier on that merger. Very quickly, Anta Sports down as much as almost 9% in Hong Kong City, with a note talking about how one of the company's brands are missing estimates, amplifying the sportwear maker's structural downturn.
Yep, Phil,
all-time 4.1% in the exact formula, the advanced estimates. Better than the 3.8% growth that economists surveyed by Reuters were expecting, and a lot of the pickup actually coming from manufacturing, which is about 20%.
还是比较强势的一种技术上的一个震荡修整，觉得还是这么一个过程，还在合理的这个技术范围之内。那目前来看的话呢，指数方面啊是回落到5日均线的一个下方，主要的股指呈现比较窄幅的这么一个波动啊，而且从今天早盘来看，在指数冲高之后呢，一度是回到了一个绿盘回落，但是现在只有双创指数呢是一个下跌区，指数都是反身向上。
对，现在其他指数都已经反身向上了。
50的跌幅呢，现盘中也是有一定的收窄的。好，关于盘面的情况呢，我们就先跟踪分析到这儿，谢谢蒋一凡的及时的分享。好，下面呢再来了解贵金属的走势，连线到的是工行贵金属业务部的交易员张凯翔，你好。
好的，主持人，上周五国际金价震荡收涨，价格方面，国际金价开盘报2629.42美元每盎司，盘中最高上行至2661.40，最低下探至2627.99，最终报收于2657.03美元每盎司。经济数据方面，美国10月密歇根大学消费者信心指数初值录得68.9，预期70.8。美国9月生产者价格指数同比升1.8%，预期升1.6%，环比持平。核心 PPI 同比升2.8%，预期升2.7%，环比升0.2%。宏观事件方面，韩国央行宣布下调基准利率25个基点至3.25%，为38个月以来首次放缓货币政策。由于美国 PPI 数据月率的持平，预示美国通胀进一步企稳，从而使国际金价得到支撑。展望后市，本周3日本央行将召开市场操作会议，周4欧洲央行将公布利率决议，请投资者重点关注。就是这样，主持人。
像是这个时代的市场零距离，稍事休息，稍后继续。
To 20%, maybe just giving a little bit of a cheer at least for Jakarta Composite, up to about 7,545 in the early first hour at least of trading in Indonesia. We'll be back with the last hour of sweet signs. Don't go away. We're back in 2 minutes.
啊，这小时又过去了，很快就会到北京时间的11点上午，然后在西部的晚上8点。
The conventional wisdom is that B2B is very rational and economic, and what we find is there's this whole iceberg underneath the water of emotional buying that happens with B2B buyers, and that can be them as consumers, that can be things around their career. B2B buyers all have the best intent for their company, but some of them like to solve that by really being bold and brave and reaching for that next best thing. And some like to have best intent for the company by being risk averse. And so you end up with this tension inside of a B2B buying group. And an emotional storytelling that can sort of bring those two groups together is actually the one that cuts through. Half of all B2B purchases end in no decision. And that's because people can't agree. What we're encouraging marketers to do is to really build a brand with that buying group that addresses both the risk side of the equation and the upside of the equation.
For me, ambition and passion go together. One fuels the other. You love something, you want to get better at it. You want to learn more about it. And I think CNBC allows our
继续关注重要资讯。国家市场监督管理总局局长罗文14号在国新办新闻发布会上表示，市场监管总局将会同有关部门创新实施质量。
Shanghai. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Haslinda Amin. Here are the top stories. Hong Kong and mainland China stocks lose momentum after investors were left disappointed by the government's latest moves to support the economy. The worries over China seeping into the commodities market.
Well, Asian markets are mostly higher now, with China trading above water despite fair details from the Ministry of Finance on the size and timing of a much-anticipated stimulus package. Meantime, Hong Kong shares playing catch-ups after a market holiday and lagging the region.
Stocks in China also shrugging off inflation data showing producer price deflation deepened despite recent measures rolled out by Beijing. September consumer prices also cooling.
And another risk event, fresh trade data from China due to drop today. And let's see quickly
for the property sector. Also, government borrowing to boost the economy. Banks probably plays pretty much in place. CSI 300 index currently up 0.3%. Worth noting, China's entrenched deflationary problems. We're on watch for trade data, by the way. Export growth probably slowed. Imports barely above zero. We're tracking the yuan as well, fixing within 1 pip of estimates. PBOC probably wanting to manage yuan moves against the vol in China stocks as well as bonds. We're also tracking the yen currently at 149.31, inching ever closer to that 150 mark. Now, China's highly anticipated finance ministry briefing on the weekend lacked the firepower equity investors had hoped for. Beijing's promising more aid for the slumping property sector and indebted local governments, but economists aren't convinced it is enough to defeat inflation. For more, let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo in Hong Kong. Min, pretty much disappointment.
Yeah, well, I think the big disappointment was that we didn't get that big
彭博的反馈应该是还是对财政部的这个政策还是比较失望的。
Because any revision to the budget or new additional bonds on top of this year's quota, that has to be approved by China's legislature. So we may still hear that later in the month when the NPC Standing Committee meets. But meanwhile, the Ministry of Finance have given us a series of measures that they plan to take, and that includes issuing new special sovereign bonds to inject liquidity into the banks, because not that the banks are lacking in capital, they're highly sufficient in debt, but it could help ease off the margin pressures on these banks as the PBOC calls for cuts to mortgage rates and also cut the key policy rates as well. Other things that the ministry are doing include widening the usage of local government bond funds to allow buyback of homes and buyback of idle land to convert these homes into social housing. Now, this could help speed up the take-up rate for that home repurchase program. And the other thing that they're doing is to increase the local government debt quota in a one-off debt swap. So essentially, this would help alleviate the pressure that local governments feel to repay their debt. It could help them expand more spending to actually revive the economy. And I think the big disappointment from this press briefing is the lack of specific measures targeted at boosting consumption. There was mention of cash handout in the form of doubling the quota of scholarships for college students and increasing the financial aid there, but not anything to the tune of the massive scale that investors are looking for. And that was the missing piece, I think, that we didn't get from the Ministry of Finance briefing.
China continues to want to allay concerns. Yet another briefing to support perhaps businesses this time round. What are we hearing?
Yeah, we didn't hear any huge new policies.
Meituan is a huge standout. We got losses of 5.4% for Meituan, Alibaba and Tencent shares tracking lower by 1.5%. We're also looking at some of the mainland property stocks on the back of which came through from the Ministry of Finance at the weekend, the continued policy measures being announced, and we've given all of the gains back now, and we are tipped lower. Kaisa shares down 6.5%. We're also tracking some of the Macau gaming stocks. This as we have a new chief executive that has been elected in the enclave, the gaming capital of the world, and we're looking at Sands China and Wynn Macau shares losses of more than 6%. This is Sam Ho Fai. He is the former top judge in Macau, and he gave up that job to run for election in an uncontested race, and 394 votes out of 400 went to him. This is not uncommon for it to be a one-horse race over in Macau, and it has been for all of the chief executive elections. And what's different this year is Ho Yat-seng did not run for a second term, and he is bowing out due to health reasons. And now Sam Ho Fai, the chief executive designate, who will be inaugurated on December the 20th, which is the 25th anniversary of the handover, in which I do expect the President Xi Jinping to be in town for that, as he does come into town for the 20th and the 25th, every 5 years, and we've seen him here in Hong Kong as well. So quite a bit of weakness that we are seeing in the Hong Kong market. Sam.
Thanks so much for that, and let me bring in Rob Carnell, who is the Chief Economist and Head of Research Asia Pacific at ING, sitting around the desk with me this morning. Thank you so much for your time and coming in today. You're welcome. Yeah, it's a busy day.
我们今天的直播已经来到了1个小时38分钟，还是比我想象的要久一点的，可能大概10分钟之后吧，我们就把它关上了。
saying not very much, but sort of being there to appear to be saying stuff. Yeah. And I feel it's a little bit like that. And as you mentioned earlier, we have to wait for the NPC to give, any sort of proper monetary value to any of these things, and therefore we can't really know the timing either. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that wasn't talked about. We didn't really get anything about. People have talked about this a fair bit, consumption vouchers. We didn't get that. So the consumer sector, that has been a little bit of a soft part of the economy so far this year isn't getting much, or it doesn't appear to be yet. And we didn't get anything on infrastructure either, which is the other sort of area where if they wanted to make a quick sort of, let's get a quick bang for our buck out of this, that's probably the easiest way to get things up and going. And it was a bit more sort of, indirect through helping local government.
However, I think the market reaction seems to be, on the slightly disappointing side, largely driven by a few things. One is I think the market had a really high expectation. So the market had a strong rally in early October. Look at CSI 300 index, it bounced, rallied about 40% from its trough. That's way ahead of the fundamental of the listed companies, right? So it is natural to see a little bit of cooling down of the so-called overheated market for Chinese equities at this stage. But I think the policies really paved the way for the next, couple of quarters of recovery. That's important.
June, it is also about the fiscal stimulus that people are looking out for, and the government has said it is able to raise its fiscal deficit. The question is really by how much. I mean, there's some indicating perhaps 3%. Is that enough?
I think it is generally acknowledged that we probably need more to really stabilize and accelerate economic growth. The government
这个形式还可以，可能过一两天如果晚上看行情的话，还会开直播，所以反正也要看嘛。
I think there's still 1 to 2 trillion of capital in the local government fundings. So that
对，就像说的，我可能还会研究一下怎么把它推到退池。
So there may be another 1 to 2 trillion in the property market stabilization by back of the land, etc. So embedded in the conference messages, there are 3 to 4 trillion of capital injections. However, I think it is consensus that more definitely will be needed in the next 2 years to sustain a more smooth recovery.
June, we're showing the estimates for GDP for a lot of the top banks that we're tracking. Goldman saying that it's raised its GDP target for the year to 4.9%, but it's still below the 5% that China itself is targeting. I mean, what do you make of China's conviction that it will get there?
Yeah, I think a 4.9% GDP growth or a 5% GDP growth is in the ballpark range. So I think the Chinese government's guidance is around 5%. So we also see Goldman Sachs raising the GDP growth this year to 4.9% this morning. I think it's largely driven by the fourth quarter recovery based on the stimulus packages. I think investors are still looking into what is beyond the fourth quarter and looking into 2025, how sustainable and how well these policies will be implemented.
June, intensive market narrative.
Yeah, I mean, look, the whole tourist thing is quite interesting. I mean, it hasn't really kicked off post-pandemic. I mean, it's in different parts of the region you're seeing different things, but it's definitely not just returned back to normal. I think people are looking at different places to go. There are different groups of people travelling, going in different directions. So it's very sort of still quite a mixed up picture, and I don't think we've even still returned to pre-pandemic times across much of the region. So it doesn't wholly surprise me that it's not quite how it used to be back in the old days. But maybe that is something that's just going to be the case from now on.
And, obviously with all this Chinese stimulus, Rob, and whether it's a bit vague on the details and light on specifics at this stage, I mean, how are you looking at this as far as sort of broader regional impact?
Yeah, okay, so there are two real angles to this. I mean, obviously, a strong and healthy and growing China is quite useful for the rest of the region. China's the single biggest trading partner for just about every economy in this part of the world, with the possible exception of India. And so, when China is somewhat struggling, as it very clearly is right now, that's not a good thing. Having said that, China's shortfall, if you like, in certain parts of the production side has been quite a useful little number for some of the countries in the region who've been picking up some of that market share. I mean, Vietnam's one everybody always talks about.
基本上就是恒指在跌1%几，然后目前大 A 的中证50或者在买都是在上涨0.7%、0.5%。
Double-edged sword. I think on net it's still a negative, but there are some positives there as well. Just raise a question about if you start to be raise your profile a bit too much in the region, politically and globally, is that going to get you into trouble, depending on who the next administration in the US is?
If we talk about geopolitics, Rob, some of those countries that you were naming, that's friendshoring or China +1, if you will. We're also tracking some of the China war games that started this morning over in Taiwan, and we're just getting some lines coming through. We've heard from the United States saying that the president, the U.S. president, I should say, saying that their one China policy has not changed, that there is no justification for military exercises.
For us to really look at it is really try to buy companies that are at a good valuation, and then try to buy companies with a certainty on the earning growth outlook.
Look out for the fundamentals. June, thank you so much for that. June Lee, CIO at Power Sustainable Investment Management. Also ahead this hour, we'll be looking ahead to India's latest CPI print with MK Global Chief Economist Madhvi Arora, who expects a pickup in inflation for September. But first, Robeco's head of Asia Fixed Income, Tuha Chow, will be joining us for a closer look at China's credit markets as investors digest the latest stimulus news out of Beijing. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
现中信证券融资买入金额排名前3，分别获买入41.62亿元、17.83亿元、17.64亿元。从融资买入额占当日总成交金额比重来看，有5只个股融资买入额占比超30%。其中，风靡集团、下精密、新合成融资买入额占成交额比重排名前3，分别为33.13%、32.07%、30.91%。从融资净买入金额来看，有19只个股获融资净买入超1亿元，其中中金公司、中国银河、新合成融资净买入金额排名前3，分别获净买入5.8亿元、2.5亿元、2.39亿元。10月14日 ，A 股共2家上市公司披露2024年3季报，正海磁材、综艺股份前3季度营收分别为38.1亿元、2.52亿元。净利润分别为1.89亿元、0.72亿元。截至10月14日 ，A 股已累计有7家上市公司披露2024年3季报，其中6家盈利，1家亏损，合计营收为108.91亿元，同比降8.92%，合计净利润为5.85亿元，同比增4.46%。从净利润变动幅度来看，4家公司净利润同比增加，3家净利润同比下降。近期伴随 A 股市场反弹，新发权益基金也迎来了提前节目潮，有的权益基金甚至相比原定日期提前2个多月结束募集，更有多只发起式基金1天内迅速节目。业内人士认为，当前基金新发、融资余额、外资仓位、私募仓位等仍处于低位。随着市场赚钱效应改善，市场增量资金不足问题有望得到解决。我们再来关注一下公司面的消息。中芯国际公告，易方达基金管理有限公司旗下的易方达上证科创板50成分交易型开放式指数证券投资基金增持公司境内股票 961.62万股，占总股本0.48%。增持时间为2024年10月10日，增持方式为通过证券交易所交易。本次变动后，该基金持有中芯国际境内股票1.087亿股，占公司境内总股本的比例为5.47%，占公司总股本的比例为1.36%。本次变动未导致上市公司无控股股东、实际控制人的状态发生改变。光智科技公告，公司拟通过发行股份及支付现金方式购买先导西材等先导电子科技股份有限公司全体55名股东合计持有的先导电科。
If you look at the fix, it was just one pip away from traders' estimate and below where offshore yuan is at above the 708 level, and to the likes of our MLI strategist Mark Cranfield, he thinks this tells us that the PBOC is trying to curb volatility at a time when you see enough of that in stocks and in bonds.
目前看，上证50、沪深300、中证500都在上涨，只有创业板还在下跌，基本上快打平吧。
We also have the likes of HSBC saying that over the weekend we got something for the bulls and the bears. If you're passing what we got in terms of stimulus, maybe if you're an optimist, you look to how there's this forward guidance on additional bond issuance. But it was also light on details, light on the timeline. We didn't get anything in that direction. So something for the bulls and the bears when it comes to the rate market. This could mean that things remain range bound for the time being.
Of course, investors have been chasing that rally in China. Abel Hong, thank you so much for that. Let's get market perspective with Tu Hao, head of Asia Fixed Income at Robeco. What are your thoughts on the market reaction in China? We're seeing how those gyrations have impacted the bond market in particular.
Yes, I hope that I think some of the stability is actually good. As you say, it's been quite a straight line, and I think the kind of more tempered approach that's come through, as you say, something for the bulls and something for the bears. But I think overall, I think this. But what's very clear is a change in direction, which, even if we can't get excited about the big number that we were hoping for the weekend, you can start to kind of digest that they are trying to tackle some of those underlying bottlenecks that actually you need to sort out even before you actually throw more stimulus at the problem.
So is it time to perhaps tweak that strategy in China? How might that look like?
You can start to kind of digest that they are trying to tackle some of those underlying bottlenecks that actually you need to sort out even before you actually throw more stimulus at the problem.
So is it time to perhaps tweak that strategy in China? How might that look like?
I think it's definitely one as the volatility is going to be there. So I think people getting too excited, the market tends to kind of overshoot itself, pricing too much in. But actually what the message is that it's going to be a much longer term trajectory, and it's a much more to much clearer direction, much clearer stabilization. So I think, again, imagine if it was a very kind of big number, the bond market would have had a bit of a hiccup that side, even if the equity market was happier. So I think that balancing act is going to be quite important, both on the fiscal side, but also how much bond issuance that would be put into the market, and the ability that to be absorbed by the market is also as important.
We know that investors have been chasing the China rally. What might that mean for the bond market in China?
So I think here, this is where the lack of clarity on how much issuance that's going to be done centrally versus locally, that's still kind of a big question. But I think it's very clear that that the more support will be given to local governments, and then some of the balance sheet usage is going to come from central government bond issuance. But how much that is and how much that's priced and that put through to the market, that's also going to be quite important. And how much of the banks can, with their balance sheet, absorb any new issues that are becoming from the central government is also going to be quite critical. So there's a lot for
我们大概还有5分钟左右到上午11点半的休市。
much something that we actually want.
现在连创业板都已经在上涨了。
We talked earlier about how we're seeing volatility in both Chinese equities.
就是今天上午行情上冲，然后高开下跌，然后又反上来。
How might this play out in terms of other Asian currency? You're seeing how the Aussie, for instance, got hit today.
I think those currencies that are definitely kind of looking for more stimulus from the more commodity type of names. They're going to obviously have been a little bit disappointing from a lack of a big fiscal stimulus. But I think for the rest of the kind of Asian kind of Southeast Asia in general, I think the view that growth will be picking up, exports and trade within the region can still be actually quite positive. I think those are the things to look out for. And I think on the commodity side, I think we had overshoot a little bit on expectation, and some of those commodity and then the commodity related currencies will have to take a bit of a back burner for now until we get a big number of
China. That's right. There is out of China. Also, there is out of the U.S. Election that might just impact emerging market currencies in particular.
I think so, and I think that's what now that this has calmed down, what we'll be looking to next with the election coming very close. Who will win, what those implications, and for which sectors. These are also very specific bottom-up questions that we need to be kind of digesting. And of course, the EU, again, trade tensions there are also going to be putting a lot of pressure down on some of the trade data that you're talking about coming out of China. So there's a lot of different moving parts that for us to digest at this stage.
Tuhal, before we let you go, the euro, of course, we're expecting the ECB to cut rates 25 basis points. Which are the best crosses for you to be playing when it comes to the euro?
We actually think that they're not likely to move in October, probably in September. Again, inflation there being a bit of a problem.
听听国内的股评。
On here, I think we probably.
那么快速上涨，我们涨幅我就不描述了，因为大家都看得到公开数据。那快速上涨主要是今年的这个9月底以后，在美联储降息这个释放造成的流动性外溢和人民币升值之后，央行的一系列的降准降息的政策，包括创设了这个结构性的货币工具，这个还有就是像金融监管局也发生，对吧？放宽了投资限制，那个甚至拉长了考核周期，然后这个。国家更是提出了要加大这个财政货币政策的逆周期的调节力度。从这个发生来看，实际上是把大家的情绪调动了一个极致。那我们在事实上也看到，一般来说看空的越彻底，就是9月20号之前可以说看空的很彻底了，看空的越彻底呢，反转的力量也越大。所以这种情绪的爆发性的介入，因为大量都是空仓，所以这个时候只能是加快步伐的进场的情况下，资金就会一方面预期提高了，一方面资金会推动这个股指的上升，这个都是在情理之中的。那么我们看一下整个 A 股为什么会涨，实际上我为什么会认为它是个牛市，我不是今天才说的，几个月前我就这么说的。那主要基于3个逻辑，先说估值吧。那么我们看到 A 股和港股其实在估值优势上，在全球资产中是非常显现的。
确实 A 股现在是价格洼地，因为至少美国这边已经涨得标普跟 QQ 六亲不认了。
MSCI 中国指数的目标位，
比特币还在
包括沪深300目标位调到41,000，
比较 moderate 的位置。
7月7号最新的报告中，再度发布了将中国股市列为超配，并且把 MSCI 的中国指数目标位从66调到84，就比之前更高，将沪深300的指数调到4600。那摩根大通呢是9月25到27号连续3天斥资80余亿港元的横扫中国的资产。可以看到外资是真的是在流入中国。那么再看估值，沪深300截止到10月11号已经上涨过后，整个沪深300的中位数是大概是21.79倍，大概分位在41.95，那么市净率呢是1.38，分位在10%左右。那么港股恒生指数也是涨得非常好，那么港股的恒生指数的市盈率是在12.32。市净率是1.05，跟美国标普500的这个5倍的市净率和30倍的市盈率相比，显然是更具估值优势的。第二呢，也很重要的就是政策调整呢， 这个提升了大家对经济增长预期。一方面，随着这个美国降息之后呢，实际上预计未来还会有100到150个基点的降息空间，实际上是打开了中国的降准降息的进一步的空间。所以中国的这个出口的增速呢有望达到5%，经济增长目标呢也有望达到5%左右。那这些呢实际上是所有公开数据都看得到的。那在持续宽松的货币政策和现在逆周期调整加大的力度的财政支撑之下，实际上地方债的赤字和风险以及银行不良风险的化解是有望得到很彻底的解决的，而且整个的这个减税降费这些政策又可以有益于科技创新和实体经济的利润。那还有就是像整个的这个房地产政策以及提振股市政策，这些呢毫无疑问形成了此次 A 股上涨、牛市上涨的一个基础。除此之外，今年上半年证监会其实做了很多的工作，包括监管规则的完善、全球化交易和股东减持的一个规则的规范，还有包括中小投资者利益的保护的相关政策等等，这些呢实际上制度的完善都是从根本上解决资本市场现在的一个问题。金融监管局拉长考核周期也不容小视，因为这个部分相当于长线资金入市，这些都构成了 A 股底层的上涨逻辑。那么这一次巨幅震荡是什么造成的呢？其实也可以想见，在情绪发到极致、成交量创天量的同时，获利盘也过大，短期的上涨速度过快，获利盘过大。减持公告9月18号到现在，减持公告重要股东的公告减持金额达到了70.2亿，减持的这个公告也频出。最重要的是，对于基本面和宏观面的担忧依然是存在，因为全球的经济下行在加剧，而且3季度的 GDP 的预期这个增幅不及预期，这些呢也都显示出一个问题，就是说基本面并不支持你的这个股市的这种快速上涨，所以整个市场也会形成一个慢牛。未来我们认为整个市场会在3200到4000点之间震荡筑底。但是呢，需要注意的是，整个 A 股还是一个结构流，并不是一个单边上涨的普流，所以要精选行业和个股。但是3000点以下大概率不会再进去了，反转行情已经确定。
就是说从行情来看的话，一些底层的逻辑发生了根本性的变化。
对，
政策呢是一个统筹施策，形成了政策的这种叠加效应。
中证50现在是
1.5，
沪深300涨幅1.2，基本上上午的这个感觉站稳。
之下，从基本面方面，从数据方面，渐渐的得到一定的回稳和改善。这样的话呢，就会有一些这个
港股也是只是下跌0.5，基本上今天上午是个
一个稳健的发展。那么既然
往上走的行情
是可以预期的话，投资者在这个阶段，你刚才提到，还是要关注一些结构性的有把握了。那么有什么样一些具体的思路呢？
首先，在大类资产中，虽然黄金是震荡上行的，依然可以关注，但是总体说来，债券的机会是越来越少的，只能做长线投资的策略来考虑。那么，其他的大宗商品的波动其实也在加剧，而人民币升值、美元贬值趋势也很明显。这种情况下 ，A 股我觉得权益性资产是属于可以超配的部分，但是要用3到5年的时间的这个周期来考虑。那么在板块中呢，我提出4个比较核心的板块吧。从长线布局，而且是主线来看呢，第一个布局呢就是用哑铃子布局，一个就是权重非常大的破净股。破净股是以央企和国企为主，主要集中在银行、地产、钢铁和建筑材料这些周期性的行业中。到9月24号之前，整个破净股的有738只，占比呢在全国 A 股中13.76%。实际上，在历史上10%以上的破净股的比例就是历史的底部。那么，虽然经过了这个市值管理的指引出来了以后，万德的这个5个交易日，万德的这个破净股指数上涨了25%，但是由于过去的破净程度太深了，基本上超40%，所以到11号为止，仍然有466家破净股。那么在这个破净股中，有88家公司是破净，但是股息率超过5%的。那么这些公司呢，持续的盈利能力非常好。所以我们现在投资者关注破净股的时候，可以关注那些持续盈利能力比较强，而且呢有高股息率，而且呢它在行业中和行业的地位和前景都非常好的这种破净公司。那么这些呢可以基本上集中在像银行、交易和煤炭以及轻工制造这些央企和国企之中，这个部分是可以关注的。其次呢是关注新质生产力，这个部分呢我觉得是要关注几个部分，一个就是科技创新、技术驱动 和绿色低碳这个部分，今年其实在绿色低碳上是讲了很多的。绿色低碳，技术创新中，特别是技术驱动和绿色低碳以及科技创新领域，包括半导体、人工智能、算力、生物制药、新能源，还有高端制造以及传统产业。
But what we got was some of these pledges of support for the property sector, for local government debt, and in some ways, to some, this means a signal of support that at least there is a silver lining in terms of stimulus, and it is also showing us where the focus for the government is, what its priorities are likely to be. And you have the likes of Goldman as well, for example, upgrading their forecast for the GDP this year and the next, as they think that this is a turning point of sorts in terms of
早盘还不错，我们的基本上直播就到这里了，准备整个结束，然后今天居然搞了2个小时，谢谢大家。
This divergence is interesting because if you flip the board, the other dynamic that I wanted to highlight is what we're seeing in terms of one gauge of the premium of A shares over H shares, and it shows you where